and inshallah continuing today our 13th day of Tafsir Surah Al Maida, and yes, we are still on the ayah. Let's see, so that ayah is basically ayah number 4, and we've been, of course, speaking just within this ayah, فَكُلُوا مِمَّا أَمْسَكْنَا عَلَيْكُمْ, and certainly yesterday we talked about whether if, of course, our hunting dog was with other dogs, what would the ruling be? And we also talked about the different rulings that, or at least the, let's say the controversy, or at least the debate between scholars, if the hunting dog belonged to a Jewish or a Christian master, or even Zoroastrian or Hindu master, on whether it would actually take the same ruling as whether it takes the same ruling as if we are to consider their slaughter. So then we went into that debate and spoke about the evidences. So of course, here we go. This is the main thing. And where is it exactly taking the same ruling as their slaughter or not? We also talked about if, for example, the person that sends out, whether they're hunting dog or hunting animal, and they fetched some prey, but then it got lost. And we said that the whole idea is to make sure that this animal basically died as a result of the hunting process that was done. So whether it gets lost, for, in other words, the hunt goes missing, or at least that prey goes missing for a day or 2, or even 3. Of course, we're going to look, 1, is it decomposed, and certainly 2, making sure that it did actually die as a result of that hunt, whether it's a dog being sent or whether it's an arrow or a bullet being or at least hitting that prey, and therefore the circumstance that surrounds that animal, that it doesn't appear to have died due to another circumstance, whether it was drowning or falling from high. And we also talked about other details in regards to, of course, different types of, let's say, hunting animals, whether it's a bird or a hunting bird, meaning, of course, carnivores, certainly, or whether we're speaking about other animals that are doing the hunting other than dogs. So we talked about those sides. And of course, we left at category 15. Remember, they are 28 categories that al-Qurtubi basically had classified his tafsir in, and we talked about this before, and we said al-Qurtubi is more focused on ahkam al-Quran, the legislation within al-Quran. In other words, the ayat within the Quran. Doesn't mean that he skips the other ayat, but he gives more focus on the ayat that are basically focused on ahkam. So, of course, certainly this ayah is focused on Islamic legislature and certainly Islamic rulings. So that's why he was, I guess, expanding the areas that he discusses. All right, so number 15 is where we left off at, but I'm not going to go in details with that. The reason why I didn't want to discuss number 14 is really because he was discussing the word mimma, which is more constituting, so it's a compound word in where it is constituting of 2 words, min and ma. So you could see it's min and also ma, in where this in Lugha Arabiya, so we're looking at this one in where it's a compound word, min and ma. And of course, if it's a compound word, they're going to break it up and basically explain each and every single compound or part of the compound word and what does it really mean and what does it really refer. And I'm not going to go in details with that because, you would really have to have a background in the Arabic grammar in order to understand, okay, ma, it can be in 8 different interpretations, and so the min as well. So I'm not going to go into that because it's going to be something hard to explain when it's in Arabic grammar, because not everything in Arabic grammar has an equivalency as in English grammar, because it basically has a completely different structure. So Semitic languages have similar structures, and of course, Latin languages have a similar structure. Well, I mean, not necessarily always, but so if you were to look at French, the structure in French is, or Spanish, let's say, and Italian, it has a lot of similarities. French and German, well, no, a little different, but English, of course, has a completely different thing, but still there's a basis in where even the words that are conjugated. But of course, Semitic languages, if you were to look at Arabic and Hebrew, they definitely have a lot of similarities in whether we're speaking about grammar or whether we're speaking about meanings or whether we're speaking about the conjugates. And so I'm not going to go into details with that because the English language has a completely different structure. All right. So number 16, let's go to category 16. And he was actually talking about the ayah is indicating that it's permissible to take dogs, not necessarily as pets per se, but it is basically showing and indicating that it is permissible to take the dogs in for the purpose of hunting or the different necessary purposes. So whether that was for, let's say, dog keeping in order to guard, let's say, the person's sheep or the person's let's say perhaps farming or crops. So that was definitely permissible. Now, yesterday you asked a question, Noura, on whether there are other examples where a hadith, in other words, in the beginning of Islam, the Prophet ﷺ, or at least in the beginning of Islam, there were certain rulings, and then later on they were abrogated. So this is another example of different things that were abrogated in the beginning of Islam, in the beginning of Islam, it was obligatory to kill dogs. In other words, dogs and keeping dogs, even if it was for the purpose of guarding or hunting, it was not permissible at all, period. In fact, in the beginning of Islam, and it was actually right there, I mean, mentioned in where even if a woman, and the word is murayya, which basically means even if it was some woman basically having a dog along with her, and she was basically just being a shepherd, it was obligatory to not have any dogs whatsoever. You could see this hadith was in Sahih Muslim in where يأمر بقتل الكلاب فننبعث في المدينة وأطرافها. They would go to Medina and even the suburbs of Medina, and any dog that they would find, they had to basically make sure that they would kill those dogs. And even if it was some, of course, lady, some woman, the word murayya is actually a tasghir imra'a. Okay, what that means, it's basically the word is imra'a, woman, but the word murayya, it's kind of like speaking of a basically of something smaller, but this is not smaller to mean, the short lady and all of that, but this is actually to speak about even if it's a young lady, and if she was basically having her own dog, that they were basically killing those dogs as well. So why was that happening in the beginning? Allahu A'lam, but then the Prophet ﷺ, so here it was abrogated. So the Prophet ﷺ then said, quote, من اقتنى كلبا إلا كلب صيد أو ماشية نقص من أجره كل يوم قراطان. So here the Prophet ﷺ then, quote, said, whoever is keeping a dog, except if we're speaking about a dog used for the purpose of hunting, or the dog used for or a dog that is used for the purpose of helping in the shepherding. Of course, if those were an exception, if for some other reason, then they would have their deeds reduced every single day as qiratan. Now, I want to look at the word qirat, because the word qirat, remember, in English, we would basically, whether we're speaking about diamonds or whether we're speaking about gold, we would say it's 24 karat or 21 carats or 18 carats, etc., or 22 carats. So that's where the word is coming from. So il-qirat is more of, let's say, a currency, or it's not a currency. Maybe I should say that it's basically to describe a valuable thing, in where it's speaking about it would speak about something that is valuable. It would speak about, well, even if it's this amount of treasure or this amount of valuables. So even if it is basically qiratan, whether it's one qirat or two qirat, in where the Prophet ﷺ was right there telling you that your deeds are actually measured in qirat. It's like, it is exactly like you would measure diamonds or gold, in where they're extremely valuable. In other words, you would lose a lot of valuable deeds that you had actually invested and you had basically worked hard to get, in where you would lose that amount. And it's not speaking about just a carat or two, but it's actually speaking about qiratan or qirat, in where it's telling you you will lose a whole amount of good deeds. And certainly the person losing a whole amount of good deeds, if they were to take dogs other than for hunting or shepherding. All right. The Prophet ﷺ also narrated, so you could see, let's look at that number 3 and actually see, is that an authentic hadith? All right, so here we go. It is narrated in Sahih Muslim and Sahih al-Bukhari. All right, Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari, which actually tells us that it is an authentic hadith. Let's see another hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ittakhadha kalban illa kalba mashiyatin aw saydin aw zara' انتقص من أجره كل يوم قيراط." So I would say within the same area, in where the Prophet ﷺ says, whoever takes a dog, except a dog for basically, here we go, as keeping or even hunting, or certainly keeping for their farming, or at least crops, then in that situation they would have their deeds reduced each and every single day as qirat, or basically in huge amounts of treasures right there. So you could see qirat is singular, qiratan is basically plural, but plural in dual, than actually plural in where we're talking about a tremendous amount, in where it's plural, but this is dual. So at the end of the day, whether we're speaking about an amount that, can we calculate? No, this is not telling you that you can calculate it, but this is telling you that this is a tremendous amount. Okay, so it's not that we would be capable of calculating our own deeds, because it's basically something that you wouldn't really know. So to actually say, yes, well, not a bad thing, I'll give away a couple good deeds, or I'm willing to give away a couple good deeds, etc. No, it's basically telling you that this is going to be worth your own deeds. But I want you to look at one thing. Many times people will say, well, I mean, a couple good deeds, not bad, but you want to keep in mind that number one is that the hadith was not necessarily giving you the amount. It was telling you that this is going to not only affect your deeds, but it was going to affect your heart as well, because you want to keep in mind that that the malaika won't even enter the home where there's a dog in it. It was really funny. When I was doing my master's degree, there was a very stupid, let's call it that way, in a silly article that was written by a neoconservative, and he was basically saying, what's the common thing between I guess what is it, the basically, the common thing that you would recognize, and where that I guess the uh sorry everybody, kind of lost my chain of thought. Anyhow, so he was basically saying, what's the common thing between dogs and terrorists? Is that no dog well, no, wait a minute, how do you do this? That okay, so terrorists, he says, hate dogs, and of course that's one way to see who's actually a terrorist, is to see whether they're willing to embrace dogs or not. It was, sorry everybody, it was a very silly article. I don't know why I brought this up, but anyhow, all right, let's continue right there. Never mind what I said. All right, so why is it haram?
That's okay. That help us keep our attention.
Exactly. Why is it not permissible to have dogs as pets? Okay. So if we're speaking about it's haram to have dogs as pets, the scholars actually had differences of opinions on the reason why. So some of the scholars actually said, well, what this does is that, number one, the cause is basically within the community, in where when dogs are around, they would basically start barking, and it's going to affect, I guess, the quality of the society's peaceful life, and that when they start barking, it's affecting them. So they considered that the reason was really perhaps affecting the Muslims, and therefore at least the community. So therefore you don't want dogs around. So they related that that's the reason why. It doesn't mean, what if, of course, I basically had trained the dog not to bark, does that make it halal? The answer is no. This is just trying to look at some of the wisdoms. Other scholars, they said no. The reason why having dogs as pets is basically because the Prophet ﷺ had actually said that the malaika, or the angels, would not enter a house or a place that has dogs in it. The third opinion said no, it's because they are impure, and certainly you don't want something that is impure. So they looked at it that the dog itself is impure. Other scholars, they said it basically prevents the malaika from coming in. And the fourth opinion said, well, it's basically because in Islam, you're supposed to be bringing in what is supposed to be helpful and useful. And therefore, if it's not helpful, not useful, then you shouldn't have it at home. All right. And of course, other scholars, they basically explained that no, it depends on the kind of dog. And we're not speaking on the kind of dog, on which kind of dogs can be entering your home. But the other scholars, they basically considered that certain dogs are actually, let's say, permissible to keep as shepherds, or at least to help you in shepherding, or to help you in other, let's call it maintenance. Okay, let's just use the word maintenance rather than going in certain details. Now, one thing is that there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, عليكم بالأسود البهيم ذي النقطتين فإنه شيطان. We did talk about that, where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, keep mindful or stay mindful of the black dogs. When we say mindful, in other words, be cautioned, or the Prophet ﷺ is warning us of the black dogs, because he said فَإِنَّهُ شَيْطَانٌ. We did go in details on whether this is metaphorical or whether this was literal, and the different the different opinions between scholars in that regards. Now, one thing, of course, is I want to take you onto another page, and of course, the question that pops up is, what about the dogs that are basically taken not necessarily for, the kind of maintenance, let's say outside maintenance, let's call it outside maintenance, but we're speaking about inside maintenance. What do I mean by inside maintenance? I'm talking about perhaps you're taking a dog in order to help you, probably at home, in where it could be a person that might have diabetes, probably a person with autism. They'll sometimes recommend that and tell you that, yes, that helps them. Or somebody with, right now, of course, there are certain dogs that are trained to help detect if somebody has, just by smelling their breath, they'll know whether their sugar level went down. So they're trained to do certain tasks. Of course, let's call it medical tasks. All right. So are those permissible to keep at home? And will the malaika not enter? How do we understand the ruling in that regard? So one thing you want to keep in mind this hadith, and where the Prophet ﷺ in Sahih Muslim, we just mentioned this hadith, he said, whoever takes a dog, except the dog where it is for maintaining, whether we're speaking about your sheep or maintaining your animals, basically, or maintaining a certain task in order to do hunting, or whether it's maintaining your crops. So in the end is where you could see that the Prophet ﷺ did consider certain necessary exceptions, in where when we're speaking about the reasons why this dog is being used, in where there is an exception, and these words are to let us know that the exceptions are basically to be considered. And that's why in Nawawi, in his book, of course, Sharh Sahih Muslim, of course, because this hadith is in Muslim, so you're not going to find better than in Nawawi to explain it. And he said there are differences of opinions on the permission of keeping dogs, and of course, whether it's to preserve the homes or whether it's to preserve the path. In other words, you're taking your dog along, probably because you're going on a hike or probably a walk in the woods or whatever it is. So he said, and what is preponderant in where it is permissible to take along dogs and to have dogs in case of necessity. So when we're speaking about necessity, whether it's outside of your home or whether it's along a path or whether it is within your crops. In other words, we're just basically looking at, it would be إباحة اقتناء الكلاب للمنافع كلها. It would be permissible to have and keep dogs in where there is a necessity. So the necessity is basically going to determine whether it is important, whether it's to keep away harm or whether it's to bring in a benefit. And in that situation, of course, to bring in security, and certainly in that situation, it would be permissible. And in those circumstances, it basically is not haram to do. Okay, so just keep that one in mind. And of course, when you're looking here in Ibn Abd al-Barr, even though Maliki madhab, but agreed with Nawawi, even though Shafi'i madhab. Let's see Hanafi madhab, in where al-Jassas as well, he also mentions, and al-Jassas is actually Hanafi madhab, And he said what we would understand from at least what this hadith is indicating is that الإباحة تناولت ما علمنا من الجوارح وهو ينتظم الكلب وسائر جوارح. And of course وذلك يوجب إباحة سائر وجوه الانتفاع بها. I want to look at that one in where he said, well, this is indicating that it is permissible not to only take as well dogs as for a necessity, whether we're speaking about guarding or whether we're speaking about other areas, but this is basically indicating that it is permissible to take even other animals as well if necessary. And certainly if we're speaking about سائر وجوه الانتفاع بها, in other words, to use it in various ways for a benefit and certainly to bring and cover a certain necessity and basically for certain interests. So therefore, he said, for therefore, it basically indicates that it is permissible to buy dogs if we're talking about in situations where it is necessary. To buy dogs if we're talking about medical dogs, if we're talking about hunting dogs, we're speaking about probably same thing when we're speaking about certain trained birds, and certainly use it for various reasons that is, let's say, within the necessity and not necessarily just for the sake of just having a pet. And, you know, when you're looking at al-Mawsu'a al-Fiqhiyya, here, of course, al-Mawsu'a al-Fiqhiyya, it's almost 46, 47 volumes, 46, 47 volumes, a huge in fiqh encyclopedia, perhaps one of the most important. I would always go to al-Mawsu'a al-Fiqhiyya. It's actually done by the Kuwaiti, well, it's considered awqaf, but it's definitely one of the best works out there. They said, all scholars had agreed that it's not permissible to keep dogs unless there is a necessity, whether we're speaking about hunting, whether we're speaking about security dogs, or we're basically speaking about different areas that the shari'ah, and when we're speaking about shari'ah, we're not talking about straight here, we're actually talking about that Islam had considered as a necessity, in other words, considered as certainly a priority, in other words, within the legal maxims. And therefore, it's important here. Well, let's look at one of the most important scholars, Ibn al-Mabrad or al-Mibrad. Ironically, his name is actually, it is actually read in different ways, al-Mabrid or al-Mibrad. At the end, he's Ibn Abdul Hadi, and he is Hanbali madhab, but he wrote a whole book. It's called Al-Ighrab fi Ahkam al-Kilab, which is really strange, and where his book is actually speaking about just on the ruling of keeping dogs. In other words, having dogs at home. It's just a whole book. And the good news is that this book is actually available, and it is in PDF, and we've got some scholars that did a good job, and what they did was actually get this book. And let's see, I'm going to show you the book, and this book is available in PDF, and you can actually get it. Let's see. So this is the book. You could see it's in 382 pages. Can you actually see the book? Did I make yes, I did do it. Okay, this is, you could see Al-Mabrid or Al-Mibrad, and they had different names, and he died 909 Hijriya, not 911, but 909 Hijriya. And this book, you could see it was reviewed by these scholars right there, put in the effort. And let's see, the book is available, and let's see what they did. Let's go to the book and see. So here we go. This is the book. I hope it opens up with our slow bandwidth. Okay, there we go. So here we go. This is basically the book right there, in where you can see that you can actually get the book. And one thing is that remember the two scholars that I showed you? So they basically did what is called a tahqiq. So all that is in the footnote, and certainly those are actually telling you the amount of effort that they had done in order to make sure that you recognize the resources. All right, so I'm not going to necessarily go to that. I'm basically telling you that the book is available, but I'm going to take you to this good article that I found on Islam Web in this regards. And let's say he quoted from that book instead of me going over the book, and he said that the scholars had said that it was permissible to keep dogs for different reasons, whether it's to preserve the different cattle or whether it's in order to do, let's call it permissible hunting, or whether to preserve the crops. So, and of course, and whether the harm was coming from humans or whether the harm was coming from different animals or from wild animals at the end, in where to preserve crops, to preserve, of course, the person, whether it's preserving the person from different enemies. At the end, of course, it's basically indicating that to preserve the person's life, to preserve the person's health, to preserve the person's property, to preserve the person's property, whether inside or outside, is considered a necessity. And therefore, we could see that from this hadith, it's basically indicating that the preservation of life, preservation of property, preservation, of course, of home, whatever it is that we're speaking about, in where it would basically indicate that it is permissible in situations where a person's life, a person's health, and a person's security is basically depending on this dog. In other words, whether we're speaking about the quality of life or whether we're speaking about an actual let's say, preservation in where a necessity, then in that situation, it would be permissible. But taking dogs as pets in where, let's say right now, we're seeing a lot of different studies or different, of course, different, what should I call it? The therapist would tell you by taking a dog, your quality of your life or even your chance of having a better life is going to be increased by probably, I don't know, 60% or whatever. All of those different studies are not necessarily completely objective. So I would be really careful with a lot of those studies, because a lot of times I think it's really important to understand that a lot of these so-called studies are more influenced by a certain culture. But if we have, let's say, in where real trained dogs, in where certainly might be capable of detecting diabetes, or probably for people with a disability, in where to help them probably find their way perhaps to the masjid, probably to their store, probably to whatever is needed, and blind, or perhaps somebody that can't walk, etc. So they're there to guide, or they're there to help them. Then in that situation, it would definitely be permissible, as we could see in this hadith. What about those that have autism? One thing, I mean, alhamdulillah, that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed me with a child with autism, but he's more on the spectrum than actually severe autism. And I'm aware that some, especially if we're talking about severe autism, that indeed, when it comes to dealing with pets, they find some connection in where they find it easier to deal with pets and easier to deal with animals than with human beings. So we're aware of that. So we just have to keep in mind that when we're speaking about those situations where, if, for example, now number one is that the case cannot find an alternative. In other words, if a cat is not a better alternative than a dog, then in that situation, if we have enough studies and of course recommendations by, let's say, specialists to help us really see that this is the best option for this particular case. And we're seeing, let's call them Muslim therapists that are recommending for this exceptional case to use, for example, dogs, because dogs are different than cats. And in that situation, like I said, if we have enough recommendations by Muslim therapists for, let's say, somebody with autism, then in that situation, it would be permissible to keep. But you want to keep in mind, a lot of times, like I said, they would give these recommendations based on their culture and not necessarily based on an objective study. Just keep that in mind. So if, let's say, an alternative that is halal, whether it's a bunny or whether it's a cat or a hamster, is not doing that help, and it seems that only a dog would keep this autistic person, I guess, feeling accompanied, quiet, all of that, then in that situation, it would be fitting within, let's call it, the comprehensive statement within this hadith, which basically indicating if we're speaking about a necessity, whether it's preservation of health or preservation of mental health or preservation of security or preservation of property. So if it's fitting within that and we have enough studies to prove that, then it would be, inshallah, permissible to keep. So this is just to basically answer the question in regards to dogs. Can we actually have maintenance dogs, assistant dogs, etc.? And hopefully I answered that question. The other part, of course, that
would go back to the which legal maxim? Would that be mental health?
So just because remember the legal maxim, if we're speaking about, remember the DNAIM, the
the aql.
Right. So if we're talking about an autistic person, certainly,
Okay, jazakallah khair.
we're speaking about maintaining aql, in where it's a necessity. And where
Yes, I totally agree. I knew someone who was on the spectrum, and the doctor recommended birds. So it just, like you said.
Right. So on the spectrum is quite tricky. On the spectrum is quite tricky because when we're speaking about somebody on the spectrum, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not a specialist, but I would say on the spectrum is quite tricky because sometimes they would be classified on the spectrum. But to be honest, I think many are classified for a number of different reasons, not necessarily that not necessarily because that there's no way of necessarily treating them, but I would say sometimes they're put on the spectrum because they may lack certain social skills. But I saw the effect on my own son when we got out of America and just came to Malaysia. There was more, I would say, a wider range of social interaction. I definitely see within these 7 months a huge difference on my child just within these 7 months, when the area I would send him to just go buy something from the store completely safe, and he would go, and he was definitely getting a better interaction, and therefore I could see that it's taking away a lot of those fears that he was having compared to when we were living in the US. So exposing him to more and more outside interactions other than, let's call it, the limited interaction at home was actually taking away the spike of that autism that was there at one point. So, I'm just really doubting a lot of these categories and these classifications. And to be honest, I think sometimes those classifications are, I don't know, but I think sometimes those classifications are exaggerated. So I'm not a specialist, but I'm just starting to doubt whether I can actually put him on the autism spectrum even, because he's doing wonderful compared to what I had expected when he was younger than this. He's doing wonderful once we change the environment. But I do recognize,
Alhamdulillah.
and that's a thing, sometimes I do recognize that certain institutions in America would want to put certain children within the spectrum because they would get funding from the government and funding from different organizations. So there's let's say it's seen as a customer. So it's like, okay, let's find as many as we can to put them within this category. So it becomes like another customer, and therefore they would be classified and put within this classification because it's seen as another person that would basically make our business work. So I would be really careful. I think, I don't know, don't take my word for it, but this is definitely more of anecdotal than actually an expertise or a specialist speaking. This is very anecdotal, but definitely the closed atmosphere and closed environment definitely does enhance the lack of social skills, and definitely enhances the disabilities in at least the social skills disability, in where once you change the environment, you're basically letting the child navigate the world and certainly increase their social skills and definitely improve their social skills. And that way, instead of you doing it for them and speaking about it from a theoretical stance, you're letting them recognize it by giving them more spaces to navigate and more people to work around. So this is, of course, speaking about the spectrum and not necessarily those that are really autistic. So that's a different story. But again, this is anecdotal. Don't take my word for it. I would love to hear, a specialist and what they would think about this. Anyhow, let's continue and go into my area of specialty. All right, well, let's see. So Al-Qurtubi also says that in this area, that was really interesting when he was saying this ayah is indicating how somebody that has knowledge is supposed to be revered, or at least honored, and considered this let's say this honor in where over somebody that is not educated or somebody that is ignorant. And he said, because even when a dog was trained, and even when the dog was given some form of, we don't want to say knowledge, but some form of training, how he would basically have some specialty, some honor, some level of let's say value in where over other dogs. So if we're having a dog get training, and just because of the training, he basically had some level of honor, how would we look at a scholar if they were to get valuable ilm? Okay, so this dog only had one side of, we don't want to call it knowledge because knowledge is something else, but had some level of training. So this is right there in where, ironically, I'm not really sure how Al-Qurtubi actually wanted to put that within what is derived from this ayah, but it's really interesting. Let's see. Ali ibn Abi Talib basically said, لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ قِيمَةٌ وَقِيمَةُ الْمَرْءِ مَا يُحْسِنُهُ. He said everything has a value, and the value of any human being is basically dependent on what they master. So what they master, you could see right there in where it was mentioned in Al-Munawi and Faid al-Qadir. Al-Munawi is basically from Armenia, from Egypt, and his book Faid al-Qadir is basically a book in hadith in where he basically right there just mentioned that that Ali ibn Abi Talib did actually mention that. And it's really interesting. It's like, well, the way that you would be considered of value is really on what you really master. So ladies, if you master working even at home, you master teaching your children, don't disregard that as I'm just a mother. No, it is definitely valued, and it is definitely considered of a high thing just to learn and just to be able to even master being a housewife, master being a mother, that's the greatest thing. It's not just a wife, but it's actually with heads up and speak with all pride that you're a mother, and just to do and be the queen at home is definitely something that not everybody masters. All right, let's continue with the ayah. So right there, we're right here with Smallahi alayh. This is where we're at right now. So let's say with Smallahi alayh is basically an order and definitely an imperative verb, because it says wadhkuru. So wadhkuru is an imperative verb, and it says, and say the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on it. And scholars had differences of opinions. Is it that when I send this hunting dog off to hunt for me, or is it basically when I would start eating the food? In other words, I basically sent this hunting dog and it fetched me, let's say, a doe or a baby deer, and it brought it to me. Is it that I'm supposed to say Bismillah when I'm eating the feast after making it a barbecue? Or is it when I send the dog, hey, Bismillah, catchy, I want you to go get me that doe right there? All right. So, of course, differences of opinions, and certainly in the end is that to say Bismillah, there's more details on when exactly is it done. And he said there's more details in and there are more details in Surah Al-An'am when that is going to be discussed. Of course, let's see what ayah. Ayah 121 in Surah Al-An'am. Okay, we're going to get there, inshallah. And some scholars actually said, no, this is actually speaking about saying Bismillah when you're about to eat. And he said, وَهُوَ الْأَظْهَرُ, which I'll look at that one, because Al-Qurtubi said, which is most likely, is that when we're speaking وَذْكُرُ اسْمَ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ, he said, which is most likely, it's not saying Bismillah, catchy, go get that deer over there, but it is basically that catchy, that deer, and you're pointing to that deer, and then catchy brings the deer, and basically you barbecue it, and then you're like, Bismillah, man, that was good. Okay, so that's basically what Al-Qurtubi had regarded as the preponderant. So why did he regard that as the preponderant? Remember, if you're not going to regard an opinion as the preponderant, we would definitely need to say the evidence to it. So the evidence, he said, well, in Sahih Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ actually told Umar ibn Abi Salama, he said, Ya ghulam, sammillah wa kul biyaminik wa kul mimma yalik. He said, the evidence is the Prophet ﷺ was telling Umar ibn Abi Salama, oh ghulam. The word ghulam actually is basically a young boy until the age of puberty. So we're talking about a preteen, in where he told him, Samillah, say Bismillah. So that's an imperative verb right there, ordering you, say Bismillah before you eat, and eat with your right hand. And of course, the beginning of this hadith is that Umar ibn Abi Salama was a young boy, and he said, وَكَانَتْ يَدِي تَطِيشُ فِي الصَّفْحَةِ في الصحفة. And he said, my hand was going around within this whole dish, and it was eating a little bit of there and a little bit of here. And basically, just the Prophet ﷺ was definitely wanting to teach Umar ibn Abi Salama the adab, the manners of eating, that when you eat, you want to basically follow a certain etiquette. You want to make sure that other people are not disgusted by the way that you're eating. Say Bismillah, eat with your right hand, and eat with what's in front of you. What if, someone else had their fries in front of them, someone else had their Caesar salad or whatever? So in that situation, you can ask to give it to you or ask to pass it on. But don't start letting your hand and your sleeves going to other people's foods and messing up the whole place, but learn how to maintain the whole meal as number one, of course, not contaminated. Two, in where you're letting other people also not get disgusted. And three, you're also eating and preserving, let's call it your germs or whatever, your area, and not necessarily confusing all of the things around. All right, let's see another hadith Hudhaifa, that the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ الشَّيْطَانَ لَا يَسْتَحِلُّ الطَّعَامَ أَلَّا يُذْكَرُ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ. So that shaitan would consider it lawful for any meal that did not have the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on it. So what does it mean that considers it lawful? So shaitan will basically come and eat with you. Does that mean that they'll eat with me? I mean, I can measure the weight of that food in front of me, and it didn't reduce any weight, and it's going to stay the same, whether I had said Bismillah or not. So you want to keep in mind, we're not talking about, you're right there sitting on that meal and you're going to be seeing, the chicken going up, some kind of haunted chicken going up, and your fries, all of a sudden, they're coming up and going somewhere, and all of a sudden they're swallowed up. You're definitely not going to be seeing that. It's not a movie here, some kind of an exorcism movie. Okay, but no, this is actually speaking about the barakah of it, the blessings of it, and not necessarily the food all of a sudden being swallowed up right there. All right, so this is speaking about the barakah of it, and certainly the shaitan joining along. See, if the person forgets Bismillah or forgets, now the word at-tasmiyah is basically the word here is an abbreviation for the word Bismillah. So the word tasmiyah is Bismillah. Halhala is La ilaha illallah. Or الاستعاذة is أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. الحوقلة is لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. Okay, so that's basically an abbreviation. All right, if a person forgets to say Bismillah at the beginning of their meal, basically what you would want to do is say Bismillah at the end of it. What's the evidence? Well, the evidence is what was narrated upon Umayyah ibn Makhshi. His name is rather strange, right? And that the Prophet ﷺ had seen a man while he was eating, and he didn't say Bismillah. When he was at the end of the last bite, the Prophet ﷺ heard him, well, basically he said, Bismillah awwalihi wa akhirih. Bismillah, the beginning and the end. The Prophet ﷺ said, well, shaitan was eating with you all along, and then when you said Bismillah, the shaitan vomited everything he had consumed. So you could see this hadith. Let's look at hadith number 4, and let's see. It was narrated by Nasa'i, narrated by Ahmad, narrated by Abu Dawood. Yet in the chain of narration, there is this narrator. His name is al-Muthanna al-Khuza'i. And
yeah, I was just gonna ask because I thought that shaitan, he
right.
doesn't, yeah. from the jinn.
الذهبي said لا يعرف, that this person in that chain of narration is basically not known, and Ibn al-Madini said, well, he's actually an anonymous figure. So at the end, you could see, although not necessarily authentic, or at least, of course, not necessarily the strongest authenticity, but you could see that this hadith is basically da'if, but at the end, in where to say Bismillah or Bismillah ala awwalihi wa akhirih, whether the shaitan is going to throw up the food or vomit the food. I mean, you didn't see the food getting eaten, let alone seeing the food getting vomited. Okay, at the end, say Bismillah. You could definitely see there is an order that the Prophet ﷺ had said, well, Bismillah and Sammillah, and there's definitely an order in the ayah to say Bismillah. So if you would forget to say Bismillah ala awwalihi wa akhirihi, if you had forgotten, you could say that, even though, of course, you might say, well, I thought you said the hadith was not authentic. I want you to keep in mind one thing. Remember, there are 69 different categories, or at least different subdivisions of a hadith that are weak. All right. And same thing, I had somebody this morning give me a video that was saying that making the adhan when a child is first born is actually not proven. It's actually a weak hadith. Therefore, we've been doing it all wrong. And I would say, listen, so although the hadith is not authentic, it doesn't necessarily mean we would right away consider it as an innovation. This is a practice that was actually done. We've got a resource, although not necessarily at the highest level of authenticity, but we've got, let's say, some reference. Okay, we've got some reference. Same thing if somebody is reading Surah Al-Kahf every single Friday. Of course, we don't necessarily have an authentic hadith in that regards. Does that mean leave it? We could see some of these practices were actually practiced by the Salihin. There was some form of, let's say, I guess I would say commitment, conviction, a practice that was practiced by the Salihin that may trace back all the way to the Prophet ﷺ. Wouldn't necessarily make it an innovation. Sometimes the innovation would sometimes be exaggerated, in where you might hear somebody say, oh, this is a weak hadith, therefore it's an innovation. The scholars of usul, remember usul to mean the scholars of usul al-fiqh, they actually debated whether there is something called bid'ah hasana or not. Why? Listen to this. If you look at the word bid'ah actually means an innovation. But here's one thing. Al-Izz ibn Abd salam was actually the first. Of course, he's Shafi'i scholar. We talked about Al-Izz ibn Abd salam before, and we talked about him, seeking ilm later. He was called Sultan al-Ulama, and that's also the name for al-Kisa'i. All right. And anyhow, so Al-Izz ibn Abd salam was actually one of the early scholars that said there is something called bid'ah hasana. And he gave some examples on that. And he said, well, what does the bid'ah hasana actually mean? So bid'ah hasana means it's a good innovation. But isn't that an oxymoron? It's either an innovation to give nothing but a connotation that this is something that is invented in the deen, therefore it could only be understood as a wrong invention, as a form of misguidance. But Al-Izz ibn Abd salam explained what would be the definition or a clarification, what would actually act as a quote-unquote good innovation. And he said, well, it's exactly like when we're speaking about something that has an origin to something, in where it's not inventing something within the rituals, but it actually has an origin in the deen. For example, did the Prophet ﷺ teach any sciences for the rules of tajweed or the rules of Arabic grammar? Well, not the Prophet ﷺ, and certainly not the Sahaba knew what al-Fa'il is, what al-Maf'ul li'ajlih was, or any of these terminologies didn't actually come in. It wasn't until later that these classifications were put. Same thing when we're talking about the rules of tajweed, whether it's called al-Madd al-Lazim or whether it's called المد الطبيعي, or whether it's called الإدغام, الإخفاء, أحكام النون الساكنة, all of that, they definitely practiced it, but they didn't have any form of a classification of any of these rules. These rules came later. Therefore,
Can I ask you a question?
hold on, let me
Oh, sorry.
Complete.
Okay.
So you could say that when we're speaking about these rules, they didn't really come until later. Does that mean that teaching Arabic grammar is bid'ah, or does that actually make it as at least fard kifaya, communal obligation? It's a communal obligation because in order to understand what the Sahaba understood from the Quran and Sunnah, it's basically important and certainly incumbent upon the scholars to at least understand the Nahu or the Arabic grammar or the basically the Arabic language and the classifications, whether we're talking about the sarf or whether we're talking about a nahu, in where to understand it the way the Arab or the way the Prophet ﷺ or the way the Sahaba understood it, you're going to need at least, let's call it the technical side, in where you need the knowledge of nahu. Same thing when we're speaking about reading Quran with tajweed and so forth. You need this science to help you navigate the whole idea of how to apply it the way the Prophet ﷺ applied it. Same thing with this is not just talking about the Quran and Sunnah. Same thing. Let's say, can we necessarily call using microphones as being bid'ah? Well, the whole object was really that we needed people to hear the ceremony. Therefore, using a microphone would be a good bid'ah. Same thing if we're talking about perhaps using maybe a TV screen. We're using a TV screen in the masjid, women's area, men's area that has a TV screen where we're seeing the imam, and it makes it basically easier, especially for those that are visual learners to see the face of the imam. So definitely during the Prophet ﷺ, they didn't have TV screens, but we're using TV screens to basically give the chance for those that want to get a closer look, visual learners, and let's make it even more complex. Can we actually make khutbah al-Jum'ah using PowerPoint, or maybe using AI, or perhaps using other methods? Does that make it a bid'ah? It doesn't make it a bid'ah if it is, let's say it that way, if it is within the legislature, the legal maxims, the boundaries of what Islam actually considered as the object, as what Islam considered as the main tool. So in that sense, this is what Al-Izz ibn Abd salam had considered as bid'ah hasana. So he wasn't talking about in where, hey, I want to encourage people to basically make dhikr, and in order to keep them tentative and to make them entertained with dhikr, I'm basically here bringing a piano in the masjid and letting people together. We're basically making a song, kind of like the Christians, and we're making, kind of like the Baptists, basically, men and women making this together in nasheed, and we're here. Yes, we're trying to make it dhikr, and we're going to call it bid'ah hasana. Definitely, this was not something done by the Prophet ﷺ. Definitely, bring along music was definitely discouraged. In fact, it was considered haram. So therefore, this is not falling within the category of bid'ah hasana. This is nothing but a bid'ah, and كل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار. Every single innovation is basically a misguidance, a delusion, and every delusion leads nowhere but to hellfire. So now when we speak about, well, what falls within the category of a good bid'ah would be something that has a reference within, whether hadith, whether it's, let's say, not overly weak, not a fabricated hadith, or whether it's basically within the legal maxims that Islam had assigned, that would be considered a good bid'ah. A bad bid'ah would be something that doesn't have any origin, is or depends on a fabricated hadith, mawdu', and simply, of course, falling within this general idea, well, it's to keep people attained and entertained and keeping them feeling that they're part of it. We're bringing musical instruments, we're bringing dancing within the halaqah to have the sisters do their halal Zumba, quote unquote, and we're right there. They're doing exercises and they're basically doing dhikr, and we're keeping them energetic, and of course, making them have fun, and hey, we're doing dhikr. And in that situation, I could only call that really a bid'ah and not necessarily dhikr. Well, unless you basically wanted to not necessarily do it dhikr, but you wanted to basically entertain the sisters, not dhikr as a spiritual sense, but you wanted to do entertainment, well, call it so, but not necessarily call it that, yes, we're doing dhikr in that way. All right, so Noura, what's your question, dear?
You said that so sarcastically. I just
Oh,
wondered,
believe it or not, Noura, it is there.
oh,
It
what?
is there. They're actually, I know, believe it or not, it is there. So unfortunately, I know it sounds so
But
sarcastic,
no,
but
no,
it's
just my question was, did the Sahaba used to talk with tajweed?
did the Sahaba talk with Tajweed? So what we know is that yes, they talked with Tajweed, but not in the melodious way that right now. So you want to keep in mind that Tajweed doesn't mean to have a melodious Quranic recitation. Okay, so many people would confuse melodious recitation with Tajweed, because Tajweed basically means to read the Quran with the right makharij, with the right articulation, with the right combinations that the Prophet ﷺ had combined the letters in. And certainly it was basically it was basically tartil, to mean it was in a specific way. But having that melody within the recitation, kind of like what you would have al-Husari, or specifically maybe Abd al-Basit, or maybe certain reciters, of course, and they would have them, especially the Egyptian reciters, and where they're really fascinated with voices. If that voice, that melodious voice, is not following tajweed, that would definitely be a bid'ah. That would definitely be an innovation. It would definitely be a form of editing the Quran. But if the person is using their, let's call it, beautiful voice to read the Quran, and they're applying the rule of tajweed, then that's permissible based on the hadith of Abu Musa al-Ash'ari. Okay, so to read the voice, a beautiful voice, and apply the rule of tajweed, that's definitely good. That's absolutely good. But not at the expense of course, the rules of tajweed. So if a person wanted to, let's say, make a certain lengthening in the wrong place just because it sounded nice, then in that situation, that's a bid'ah and it's a form of editing the Quran. Okay. Now, did the Sahaba speak in Tajweed? What we know is that yes, they did speak in Tajweed, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily lengthened all their words. But you want to keep in mind that even certain words, they're basically they're in the Quran, majority is ala lisani Quraysh. It's basically off the accent of Quraysh. So what we know is that yes, it was basically based on Tajweed, and they spoke in Tajweed, and that it basically is based off lisan Quraysh. That's what we know. In fact, even, in the hadith of Umar al-Khattab, when that man came and just read إنما صدقات للفقراء والمساكين, Umar ibn al-Khattab scolded him, and he said the Prophet ﷺ had recited that ayah for us, إنما الصدقات للفقراء, and he basically did that lengthening and did that ghunna right there on that noon that has a shadda in order to explain to him that there is a certain rule that you have to maintain in order to make sure that you're reciting it as the Prophet ﷺ had recited it, and certainly as it was recited even by Jibreel alayhi salam. So just to mention that point. I hope I answered the question, Nora.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair.
وإياكم. Did they speak the hadith in tajweed? Can we read the hadith in tajweed? So let's say right here in where the person says, Ya ghulam, sammillah wa kul biyaminika wa kul mimma yalik. Can we actually read the hadith in tajweed? You know what? Let me go farther. فإن نسي التسمية أول الأكل فليسمي آخره. Can I read even these words? And of course, it would be hard for me to read with tajweed without having some melody, not because you have to have the melody. Let me try reading it without the melody. فَإِن نَسِيَ التَّسْمِيَةَ أَوَّلَ الْأَكْلِ فَلْيُسَمِّ آخِرَهُ. I'm reading here with tajweed, of course, without having a melody. And وروى النسائي عن أمية بن مخشي وكان من أصحاب رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم أن رسول الله رأى رجلي يأكل. Because why? Because we're having here رجلي يأكل ولم يسم الله فلما كان في آخر لقمة قال بسم الله أوله, it should be, this is a mistake, أوله وآخره فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ما زال الشيطان يأكل معه فلما سمى قام أكله. What did I do? Basically read it in tajweed, but without the melody. Okay, the melody is a completely different thing. Can we actually read it like we said, whether it's the hadith or even the actual words, and speak in tajweed? Yes, we can actually do that. All right, so here we go. Hope I answered that one. It is 1:30. Wow, that was so fast. Let's at least finish this part, right? Because that actually means we're going to finish the ayah. We have to. Let's continue. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ. And have taqwa, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is سَرِيعُ الْحِسَابِ. And of course, this is an imperative right here, an imperative verb, and we're wattaqullah, have taqwa. It's an imperative verb telling you this is what you need to do. It's basically have taqwa. And of course, when you say wattaqullah and inna Allah sari'ul hisab, and of course, why is it saying wattaqullah? It's basically telling you, well, those orders right there, you have to take it seriously. You have to take it in consideration, that by taking these instructions, these principles, that is related to your heart, that is related to your faith, that is related to your conviction. And therefore, keep in mind that you take it seriously, because if you don't, you're going to find yourself losing your religion without you realizing. So when you want to have taqwa, you basically got to relate it to what behavior are you taking? What are you consuming is directly related to your heart. It's directly related to your mental, let's say, your mental vision or your vision conviction and your Islam. So your Islam, your behavior is related to your Islam, and how the amount of conviction you would have within it is basically related to your heart, and certainly the amount of commitment is basically related to the conviction that you would have in your behavior. Inna Allah sari'ul hisab, in order to, of course, bring in this commitment, always keep in mind that the Lord Almighty is Sari'ul Hisab. What is Sari'ul Hisab? Sari' actually means fast, and al-hisab means to hold others accountable. But then the scholars had differences of opinion. So when we're talking about sur'at al-hisab, when we're speaking about the velocity or the speed of holding people accountable, does that mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically referring that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is encompassing and certainly having all the knowledge to what people are doing, and certainly had kept track of all that the deeds of what people are doing. Therefore, the ayah was basically telling us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in need to take the time to basically calculate all the things. The calculation is already done, and therefore the Lord Almighty is letting you know that everything is under scrutiny. Everything is under scrutiny, which basically is what this ayah indicates. وَكَفَى بِنَا حَاسِبِينَ, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you He's the one that is keeping track of all the different deeds, all the different, whether good or wrong deeds that you're doing, in order for you to take the matter seriously. In other words, you can't get away with any of those deeds. So the Lord Almighty is the one who's actually keeping track of all the different creatures, and certainly their deeds altogether would be calculated. And certainly, of course, it is possible that what this ayah is trying to say is that there is something that you have to keep in consideration, which is warning you of Judgment Day and all the different things that will be coming and happening on Judgment Day. And we're keeping in mind that Judgment Day is near, keeping in mind that Judgment Day is basically coming in soon, and therefore keeping track of whatever you're doing in order to take in consideration that there is a serious matter that you are working towards. So that's basically the end of this ayah. And inshallah, tomorrow we're going to be starting, let's say, اليوم أحل لكم الطيبات وطعام الذين أوتوا الكتاب حل لكم. You could see, alhamdulillah, we prepared already for that. And you could see it's 10 different matters, but hopefully, let's see, what is it talking about? It's talking about basically the people of the book and the slaughter that they would do, and certainly the women, the Christian Jewish women that men can marry. Does that include women can marry Christian men too? We'll talk about that as well. And what about the part about mahr? What if there is no assigned mahr? What happens to that? And muttakhidhi akhdan, is it permissible for girls and boys and to actually have boyfriends? And we'll talk about that. And what is a boyfriend? What is a girlfriend? And we'll talk about that. How are people going to get married if they're not going to have boyfriends and girlfriends? We'll talk about that, ladies, don't worry. All right, وَمَن يَكْفُرْ بِالْإِيمَانِ, and whoever disbelieves in the iman. So is this considering that certain actions are basically here related to iman? Or is that meaning that if a person were to commit a sin, that their faith would be disregarded? فَقَدْ حَبِطَ عَمَلُهُ وَهُوَ فِي الْآخِرَةِ مِنَ الْخَاسِرِينَ. So a lot of questions that this ayah covers. So I'm excited for tomorrow, because we definitely, of course, especially that right now, most of us, in fact, all the world, we basically have non-Muslim communities that are around us, and certainly whether it's their food or whether it's their women, or let's call it social interaction, all these different details, or if it's even our families. I mean, my grandmother was Catholic, lived with us, And certainly we have relatives that are not Muslim. And of course, we need to learn how do we deal with whether it's their food, whether it's social relations, how do we deal with some of these areas? Are we being intolerant, tolerant? What are we supposed to be doing? All right. This and other questions. Stay tuned. Yes, we're going to have to say bye-bye to Catchy and Fluffy, right? By inshallah, we'll have new friends, and these new friends are going to be basically maybe perhaps Johnny and Kathy. So we'll see what new friends we're going to be making, and stay tuned for more episodes. All right. Any questions before we leave? Or maybe I should have said David, okay, David and perhaps Rahel, okay, Jewish names, and Christian names would be Chris and Johnny, maybe? Well, yeah, okay. This is it. Inshallah, stay tuned for tomorrow. And ربي يحفظكم جميعا, and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And if there are any questions, go ahead, you can unmute yourselves. I guess everybody's like, no, we'll go for Kathy. It's okay. We'll say bye-bye to Fluffy and Catchy, and that's all right. I guess they don't want more Catchy and Fluffy. Okay, that's basically right there. We're gonna pause